Let's talk about the opposite. What we don't want is insecure attachment. So insecure attachment comes from lack of reliable serve and return relationships with caregivers. So, and there's a whole host of problems that we know is associated with that. So problems with intimacy and affection over the lifespan. The children are likely to have low self-esteem, difficulty maintaining relationships, having behavioral problems like cognitive disorders in childhood, academic cognitive problems, and mental health problems like anxiety and depression throughout life. So these are the things that we're trying to avoid. And you see how these relate to those adverse childhood experiences study that we talked about earlier. And I mean, we haven't actually followed these kids over the long term. And, you know, this attachment stuff is emerging out of psychology literature. So they haven't really looked very much to see how it affects the physiologic systems. Like, does it affect asthma? Does it affect immunity? We don't really know. So we're just starting to look at that. But one of the big theories is that this is the operating principle underneath a lot, you know, when you have your fight or flight activated when you don't have a safe haven to go back to when you're distressed. You know, this is the underlying belief about how it is that attachment, how it is that early experiences are affecting development over the long term. It's because of the serve and return and the insecure attachment. Now the other type, so I have these, it says types A, C, D. So we have secure attachment, it's called type B. I can observe parents with their children, separate them, bring them back together, and I can tell you if that child's securely attached or not. Secure attached is B type. And the other types, insecure as a category, are A, C, and D. And the big one I want to tell you about is disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment, can you kind of give me a feel, what do you feel when you look at this child's face? What kind of feeling do you think the child is experiencing? What do you think? Looks scared, right? Looks scared. I mean, that's what everyone says. And I think that's why they put it on the cover. But it's really strange when you think of that this child is being comforted. This child should be not looking scared when they're in their caregiver's arms. So the attachment disorganization, this is a severe form of insecure attachment. It's related to psychopathology in childhood and adulthood, and it comes from lack of serve and return, but also, you know, the more severe forms of when parents have problems, psychopathological problems, more than depression. When a parent has like a personality disorder or a parent has got a lot of unresolved trauma, this is the kind of pattern they end up working to create in their child. So, you know, for most of us, these are not things that we have to worry about. 65% of the population are securely attached. Only between 0 and 10% will end up with this disorganized attachment type, and about 10 to 20% will fall into the other insecure attachment types. But I think it's really comforting that most of us are securely attached. And we know how it is that children end up with these insecure or disorganized attachment types. And it really goes back to serve and return and supporting families. So who is an attachment figure? The attachment figures are parents generally, but you know, they could be grandparents. It's whoever is that person specific, whoever is that person that's most responsible for the child most of the time. And the attachment figures should provide protection and comfort, be that secure base, safe haven, the person who's there when you need whatever you need. And it's a long-term, intimate, reciprocal relationship, lots of emotion. That's what affect means, lots of emotion attached to it. And it's the basis for physical and psychological survival. And this attachment system that I'm talking about is actually believed to be an evolutionary, it evolved in us from over time because babies can't live without parents. There's Donald Winnicott, who's a British psychiatrist, he said, there's no such thing as a baby. And he sort of stops there and makes you wonder, what do you mean? He says there's a baby and someone. Because babies, his point is babies can't live alone. They can't survive. So they will adopt different attachment strategies in order to keep their caregiver close. So the insecure attachment strategies are really about keeping the caregiver close. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. You can talk to me about that after if you want. But these attachment strategies, while they do predict behavioral problems over the long term, they actually work quite well for the child in infancy and insecure attachment type because, for example, these kids are more, they act out, they cry more, and they get their parent to them. They bring their parent to them when they might not have because of whatever is interfering with their parent's ability to do so. So kids who have are more likely to have insecure attachment have caregivers who don't do serve and return very well. So they're insensitive, they're disengaged, uninvolved, emotionally flat and controlling. And the infants develop these self-protective strategies to manage their caregiver. And I'd like to point out that, it's the insecure, again, it's adaptive. So insecure attachment is not the problem. It actually brings the caregiver to the child. But it's the solution that the child has come upon, and it's evolutionary, like that these strategies have come about. And so if we're going to work with these, so we don't want to change. So if we're working with a family and there's an insecure attachment is an issue, that's not really the issue that the healthcare providers or service providers are going to be worrying about. It's actually the relationship. We're really concerned about the relationship, because you can't change the attachment strategy and have the family still stay the same, because whatever is happening in the family is what's contributing to that insecure attachment. So anyway, so what interferes? These are the toxic stressors that are interfering with sensitivity of the parent to the child. And the thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is this model. So when the child experiences the distress and their system for attachment is activated, and they seek comfort from the caregiver, they should be able to go to their caregiver who's going to resolve their distress, sort of down-regulate their emotions, and then resolve their feelings of distress or fear. But when a caregiver has a lot going on in their life and they're not able to be there reliably, they might recognize that they should recognize the child's distress and regulate their own distress in order to allow this cycle to work, but they often can't. Okay, so one of the things that a caregiver, a parent, mother, father, has to do is regulate a baby's state, and the way you do that is modulate the intensity of stimulus or stress that the child is experiencing so that you can engage and sustain the baby's attention longer. So we're going to talk about states. This will make a lot more sense in a minute. But really, that's what you're doing. This is fancy language for just sort of following the baby's lead and making sure that you're not overstimulating or understimulating the baby, that you're actually responding and reading the cues that tell you that the child's interested in this or that. And so in this way, mothers and fathers are hidden regulators of their infant's fight or flight response, or in other words, their endocrine and their nervous systems. That's the video I want to show you. And I just want to give you an example from my own research about, I sort of alluded to this earlier, but we were really interested to know if depression in moms, if the toxic stressor of depression in moms was responsible itself for the poor development in kids, or if it had to do with that serve and return relationship that was affected by the depression. And we know the depressed moms are more likely to be poor partners in the serve and return relationship. They're not as likely to pick up on their infant's cues, they're less affectionate, they're more negative, and so on. And one of the big things is that they have negative perceptions of normal infant behavior, whereas a mom who's feeling great the baby's crying and say, oh, he just needs me to help him, he change his diaper, he needs me. A mom who's depressed might think, oh, he won't leave me alone. It's sort of a different attitude comes to bear on their relationship. Now, we talked a little bit about cortisol. When babies have too much cortisol, the fight or flight response, it predicts things like fear behaviors and hypervigilance. And we know that cortisol is neurotoxic. We saw those videos about how the brain neurons are proliferating and they're connecting, making connections in response to what's been reinforced in the environment. And because cortisol is neurotoxic, it's believed that this stress is interfering with the neurons connecting, and it's actually pruning away neurons that shouldn't be pruned and actually preventing other neurons from being formed that should be. So cortisol, the fight or flight response produces cortisol, and it's neurotoxic, and that's the mechanism by which we think that the lack of serve and return is interfering with the brain and other body systems. So in our own study, really quickly here, I just want to tell you about cortisol. Everybody has cortisol. This is our rhythm. You wake up around in the morning and your body gives you a natural shot of cortisol. It's like your built-in cup of coffee, and you have that. It wakes you up in the morning. This is your natural rhythm. Normal, everybody's got cortisol secretions. And then it drops down over the day, and it should be the lowest by the end of the day. This is normal. So we all have this rhythm. And what we wanted to know is if babies whose mothers were depressed also had this rhythm, or if they had more cortisol over the day. And here's what we found. So you see that this is the morning, noon, afternoon, night, and so the babies and the moms both had high cortisol. Moms had the normal pattern. Their cortisol went down over the day. But the babies didn't. Their cortisol stayed higher during the day. So they had more cortisol circulating over the day. And we wanted to know, what was the cause of that? Was it related to, how seriously ill the moms were with their depression, or was it related to their serve and return relationships they're able to manage? Because not just because you're depressed doesn't mean you're not able to do serve and return. It's going to predict your likelihood of increased likelihood that you're not going to be able to. But lots of moms are able to manage, with the support and family and various other services and whatnot. So we wanted to know, does serve and return make the difference? And what we found is that, infants of depressed mothers produce more cortisol. But it wasn't how depressed the mothers were that made the difference. It was how sensitive and responsive the mothers were to their babies that made the difference. So mothers who were less sensitive and responsive had infants with higher cortisol over the day. Their depression symptoms didn't matter, really. What mattered was how much they played with, talked to, made eye contact, touched, and praised their children. So the ones that did it less, likely because of their symptoms, had kids with higher cortisol. But some of those moms were able to still do the serve and return even though they were depressed. So if I put one and one together here, so we've got postpartum depression, it reduces parental sensitivity and responsiveness, it predicts higher infant cortisol in the kids, and that's the mechanism by which we think it affects child development.